Everybody got power and stuff? Yeah. All right. So today, Chris was going to do some more web stuff, but he got pretty busy, and so Chris got pretty busy, so he's going to do. Chris isn't here yet. You can bug him about it later, but instead of web stuff, for the general sort of normal sessions, I think Chris is planning to do some sort of like hardware, not hardware hacking, but sort of DIY hardware stuff. So making like a Wi-Fi antenna out of household products, and how to like make a bad USB sort of attack USB, like a USB rubber ducky, but from scratch. So hopefully we're going to use a bunch of club funding to buy a bunch of random equipment and see how subsidized we can get it. But so we've got to blow some. Yeah. Anyway, Chris will handle that a bit later. First thing, if you like coming, please sign up. It's $3 to $5, and the number of members signed up gives us more money to spend. Like not just the fee, but once we hit like thresholds, they give you a bunch more money to spend. So it's pretty good. Buy a hoodie as well if you want. This is your last chance. We're about to order them like next week. So jump on the link, buy a hoodie, and if you don't, you'll miss out and you'll be sad. So we finalized the SciSCA participants for this year last weekend. So it's going to be 12 here at Burwood, and we've got 4 students from Geelong. We've got a Slack channel for those guys. You should all be in it. If you are in that Slack channel, I recommend like downloading Slack to your computer, maybe getting the mobile app on your phone as well, so you get the notifications. You can chat at all times. We still haven't fully nutted out the training stuff because there's a lot of shit to go through. But hopefully we'll start the proper. Yeah. So we plan to run 6 to 8 p.m. for these sessions now, just to keep it nice and tight. And then after that, we'll do like a break or something. I don't know how we're going to do food. We can figure that out. Let me know how you want to do it as well. And then we plan to run the SciSCA training for the people who are competing after that, to do some more stuff once we figure out what that is. If you applied for SciSCA and your name's on that like application list as well, but you didn't make it in the teams, feel free to stay back and join in as well. So, if you start training for it now, you'll be so much better for next year's one. And whoever's running the club next year, you should have a much easier time of getting a spot as well. And plus, all of these final years will be gone, so you don't have to worry about them. Yeah. So we're not going to do a SciSCA training one this week, but we'll do some pretty manual exploitation stuff. So the people who are doing ethical hacking, I know some of you might like that. That covers some very basic. You'll see it some similar things, but that goes into so little depth that I feel like you can't even really take that class and run with it. But hopefully we can get a little deeper. That's for Chris. So obviously I'm still learning very much as well. I am by no means an expert. If I get anything wrong, or you know any better ways to do things, or you spot anything and you're like, that's retarded, please tell me. Put your hand up, tell me I'm wrong. Tell me how to do it. Because, yeah. And everything that I've learned about sort of exploitation and stuff has mostly been from studying for the OSCP. And for that, they don't care about intrusion detection systems, prevention systems, SIEMs at all. They're like, you don't have to hide what you're doing. You don't have to cover your tracks. You just go nuts, and you can be as loud as you want. So everything we do today is not going to be taking that into consideration. Obviously, in a real like enterprise environment or a proper pen testing engagement, you would take that into account. You'd have to adjust a lot of things and do it a bit differently. But yeah. So I put this together last night, so soz. But we'll get through it. Hopefully, we'll see what happens. please give me some feedback at the end as well if you think anything should be done a bit differently, or if, yeah. And obviously that last point, you have to invest your own time to get good at anything like this, especially something as technical as penetration testing. You have to read, you have to spend your own personal time. There's no way anyone can teach you everything there is to know in a classroom. It's like, people can get you started, people can answer questions, but the majority is going to be you at home doing it in your own time. If you want to like actually, or get a job in pen testing and then they pay you to do it in their time, and that's even better. Like Chris did, clever boy. So this is what I plan to do today. So quickly recap over the Recon thing. We won't spend more than 2 minutes on that, don't worry. The next step would be taking what you find in your reconnaissance and trying to figure out what's vulnerable from it. From that, you want to find out what exploits exist. So today, we're just going to be looking at using other people's exploits for stuff. If you want to get into creating your own exploits, that's a whole nother, like, start your own club. No, but I know this guy's really keen to dive into that. And hopefully one day we can, maybe in the SciSCA sessions, because there are categories on that, sort of. So once you've found an exploit that's probably going to work for a vulnerable service that you've found, you want to make sure it works for you. You're going to make a payload for yourself, put your payload into the exploit, or modify the exploit however it works. You have to read the exploit. They all work differently. And then you get a shell. If you ship it off, it works, and you're like, oh, I've got a shell, sweet. Next is post-exploitation, which is most of what you'll be doing as well. So that's once you've got a shell, what do you do with it? So yeah. And then there's Metasploit and Empire as well, which we'll quickly just look at, but I want to focus more on the manual stuff. So like when you use Metasploit or something, you're like, okay, you plug in a module, you plug in commands, you get an interpreter shell, you just say hack for me. You press enter and you're like, box is hacked. You know, sweet, but you have no idea what it did if you don't. So yeah, hopefully we'll do a bit of that. So doing reconnaissance, obviously there's a lot in Recon, but all you need for today really is knowing like port scanning. So if you do nmap scans, so any and all of the commands and tools today, I'm just going to throw in a few little things. If you've never seen the tool before, you have no idea what it does, yeah, read it. So plug in the command in Linux, read the man page, look at the help section, like the command tac help or tac help, tac h or tac help, figure out what it does, and then try and use it. But for nmap, there's lots of different types of scans, but one thing that you can use is, so this is very noisy by the way as well, so if you weren't trying to leave logs everywhere, don't do that. But today we don't give a shit, so SV, you can add that tax and it'll, every open port that it'll find, it'll throw lots of stuff at it to try and fingerprint what that service is. And it's pretty good for most main services. And if you add the NSE script banner as well, it'll actually try and ask those ports for banners as well, saying, what is your service, what is your version, tell me everything about yourself, and it'll just dump everything in your scan results. So for us, with Metasploitable starting off, that's pretty good. If it doesn't work, or if you wanted to do it a bit more manually, you can telnet to the port or netcat to the port. So the netcat / the -v is for verbose output. And you can ask it things, say it's a HTTP port, you can manually throw your HTTP request saying, tell me your header, and it'll spit out a banner. Say you go to an FTP thing, it'll probably tell you what it is. If they didn't disable it, you just go to an SSH port, they might say, open SSH, this version, what's your username? You're like, that's handy. You can use curl as well for HTTP stuff, but I found this link last night that had some pretty cool stuff in it, so that'll go into much more details on some of those things. So grab that link and try that on the Metasploitable services as well. You know what? Let's actually do it as we go. Probably should have started this before, but fuck it. So actually, who has a Kali VM and a Metasploitable VM installed today? You guys, up to you. Do you know if they can? Have you used them before? Have you dusted them off yet? And so they can, if you like, you can pull them up now and you can just sort of do it together as we go. But once we get through the slides and stuff, I want to say like, give it a go as well on your own. But if you want to walk through stuff with me, I won't just talk about it. Let's just actually do it as well. So first thing, I just want to make sure that they can talk to each other. So I've done an ifconfig here, I know their IP addresses. I can see one there, but let's just make sure they can chat. That looks good. 2.9. That looks good too. Awesome. All right, let's ditch that. We don't need to look at that. That's our remote server that we're going to attack on our local network. Not taking into account firewalls and IDS, IPS. So I did this beforehand. Alright, so let's just say I did an Nmap scan. So in this particular scan, I did the, can anyone see that? Is that? Cool. Is that readable? A bit more? Bit more? Yeah? Cool. So this particular scan, I think I didn't do a verbose, but I did S, little s, big S. Oh, I did this. Something that looks like, oh, fuck off. All right, there we go. That'll do. I did something like this. So that's to do a SYN connect scan, and then please tell me the services. And then I used the script banner, I think it was. Yeah, script equals banner. And then I put in the IP address and saved file and all that stuff, and it spat this out. And I didn't do all the ports, I only did the top 10,000 ports or something. Yo.
If you want to condense that, you can just put -A.
-A?
Dash capital A.
All of those?
Yeah.
Oh, no way.
You're doing a aggressive scan.
Disgusting. Yeah. Or you can tell it to do it for you. Is that little a or big A?
Big A.
Big A. All right. So for the recording, what this guy said is if you to attack big A, it'll do all that stuff. And so I think I only did the top 10,000 ports or something for this scan, but we can just, as an example, we can quickly take a look. So we see 21 for FTP, and it pulls out the banner, so we know it's running VSFTPD. It has this version. SSH has this version. Telnet is disgusting, but you get the idea. RPC bind is an interesting one because this is sort of used to bind multiple services from what I understand. I don't get the protocol too well, but Samba is very well known for being very terrible. But yeah, you see a bunch of services, and the idea is if you can get the version of the services or as much information about it as you can, that'll sort of help you target your attack. So let's just pick Samba, because that's pretty bad. But we don't see the version here. We know it's Samba somewhere between 3.x and 4.x, so that could be anything. But I want to find out what that version is. Samba, so you see it's running on anyone. Okay, so I remember last time I was asking questions like, does anyone not know what this is? And no one put their hand up, and everyone's silent. And then we were walking around, everyone's like, what the fuck was that? So this time, I think that awkward phase is over, right? We did the icebreaker, we did the who are we, yeah? We can do this now, yeah? Like no, fuck you. Has anyone not heard of Samba or SMB? Like, yeah? All right, read about it. But basically, SMB is like the Windows service that allows for file sharing and printer sharing and sharing resources over a network from Windows to Windows computers. Samba is basically the Linux version of that. It works with SMB. You install Samba on your Linux and the shares will work fine, the printers will work fine. So a way that you can, just from reading about Samba, if I read about the, I've got a slide here actually.
Is SMB the one that was Eternal Blue?
Yes, Eternal Blue was a massive SMB vulnerability. That's the one that sort of was used by WannaCry and Petya and all that. That was massive. I've got this link here, which I found really, really, really useful. I'll chuck the slides up after this, as soon as we're done. But that link has got pretty much like every port that is used by most services, and it tells you everything you need to know, a summary of what that port does, and it gives you every way that you can enumerate that port further. So it has like, it's a really long fucking page, but I use that religiously. It's like, it's good. I shouldn't be sharing that. I wanted to keep it to myself. But yeah. But I want to enumerate the Samba service. So there's a tool called enum for Linux, which basically goes to SMB services or Samba services and say, tell me everything you can about, I am a Windows machine, tell me everything about the service. Tell me anything the users, there's this thing called null session, so that's if it's set up to allow you to connect to it anonymously, it'll try that. If it works, it'll just, so let's just look at the output, all of the output that we get from this on a very misconfigured, which isn't that uncommon. You might learn a lot about your target and the network that it's on. So you get the idea. We get work groups, usernames, all sorts of good stuff. But all we're interested in right now is, I just want to know what version it's running of Samba. So we'll just look at the operating system information, and we can see here, it's running Samba 3020 on a Debian host. Now that's exactly what I want. I just wanted the version number. All right. So let's see if there's anything for that. So I found a service, and I'm like, now is it vulnerable to anything? There's a few ways you can look for stuff. First, you read about the service and any known vulnerabilities from that service, and you can see, track the versions. Once you reckon, like I know, I heard on the news today that Samba was really vulnerable, so I came on and checked it. 3.0.2 was pretty long ago, so it's probably vulnerable to something. If I want to find stuff for it, a great place to search is the exploit DB, which is like a public sort of database of exploits. And Searchsploit is a tool that you can do that just straight from the console. There's two other tools that I found online called Findsploit, which searches a few extra things. It'll let you know if there's an Nmap script for it, or Metasploit modules is kind of an exploit DB too, but PomPem looks a bit more. It doesn't just search all that stuff, it searches more of the internet. But I haven't used it, but if you want to give it a go, go nuts. So let's check it out. Sorry? We'll chuck it on the website. I'll do it straight after this and link it and all that good stuff. But let's look for that. I could grep it down, but I'm just going to search for Samba and see what there is. So this is all on the site exploit-db.com, which, like the Searchsploit tool on Kali, automatically pulls the latest from that every time you apt get update. So if you're just doing an apt update, it'll grab the database. You can just search through it locally. Samba 3.0.2.0 to 3025. Username, map script, command execution. So this is a Metasploit module, which is fine.
Oh, you got so much more than me.
Hey?
Did you just type in Searchsploit Samba?
Samba. Run an apt-get update first, because it pulls the latest. It pulls the latest thing, the data's, with apt, which is really handy. So there's a bunch of stuff here, but we want to find one that's going to work for our version. So some of these could work, even though this says between 21 and 24. You really need to just read the exploit and figure out whether it may or may not work. Some exploits for your version some exploits are more reliable than others, blah, 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 but because these are all like community-made things. These are all either hackers or researchers or just often, sometimes even like programmers. And these are all user-made things, so they're not made to be reliable for you. This is just somebody's thing that was uploaded, which will work. They do get they do get vetted before they get uploaded. So anyway, there's a bunch of, this one could work too. Remote heap overflow, that could sound promising. But let's go with this one because I know this will work. It's a Metasploit module, so we're going to have to be slightly script kiddie, but that's fine. So those are a few ways you can look for exploits. If you know any better ways, please tell me, but that's what's worked in the past so far. Yeah, before you do anything as well, read as much as you can about the protocol that you're looking at. And if you can get any more info out of that protocol that might help you, try it. And before you start pointing guns at things and shooting, like, try and understand exactly what the vulnerability is. So go and read the CVEs, look at the references from, those are the two like sort of databases of CVEs. Try and understand everything there is to know about the vulnerability. We could, without spending too much time, what? Let's have a look at the exploit as well. So you'll see here that this tells me the directory that the file is in, because they're all sitting locally on your drive. So we'll just grab that path. Excuse me. The rest of the path is up the top. So we want to look at user, share, exploit DB, exploits, da 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 da. So if we just go and cat that file. Cool. This is the exploit in its entirety. So because it's a Metasploit module, it's written in Ruby, and there's a bunch of extra shit around it that'll make it work with Metasploit, which we can look at. So this is a Metasploit framework thing, blah, blah, blah. This is all just making it work with Metasploit. So here is like what Metasploit will pull up when you go, grab the module. This is where it's all, where it's all written. So this will be the name, description that it'll tell you, author. CVE was interesting, so let's grab that. Let's take a quick squiz at the vulnerability itself. CV. Microsoft Remote Protocol, what does RPC stand for? Remote something call. It's remote communication in SMBD, in Samba, through the versions, allows attackers to execute arbitrary commands via shell meta characters. Change password function where username map script in the SMB configuration file is enabled. So if that's enabled in the configuration file, we can call the change password function, I think, and allows remote attackers to execute commands via shell involving functions in the remote printer and file share management. So that sounds pretty handy. That's exactly what we want to do. Execute commands remotely. If we look at, that's a shitload of references. Let's just grab one of these, remote command injection. So these are pretty much all of the references. They try and catalog all of the references on the internet to do with this particular vulnerability, including exploits. So the CVE dictionaries are just everything you possibly need. If there aren't any exploits, it'll usually link to bug trackers as well, where the devs are trying to figure it out, like try and patch the vulnerability. So from that, you could even reverse engineer your own exploit if you had no friends. But today we're just going to username map scripts, So we won't go through, we won't spend ages reading about it, but try and understand exactly what the vulnerability is. Because if you don't know what you're doing to a target computer, like you might get a shell, but also you don't know how you're going to affect the system, which is fine when you're playing in a virtual lab, but if you're in an actual enterprise environment with a proper and actual workers trying to do their jobs, and you crash systems or you delete files or you just fuck up, you make it, if you get in the way of things, then people will kick up a stink and you'll be responsible, and that's not good. So this is all stuff. This is what we want. Define exploit and end exploit. So this is our exploit right here, which is pretty damn small. Usually an exploit can be pretty large, but so it's written in Ruby. I don't know Ruby, but programming languages are more or less close together. So what are we doing? So we're defining a variable username, and in that variable we've got the special meta characters, no hup. And then we're going to have our payload up there. I don't know what the no hup, or it's actually just the text no hup. Does anyone know what that is? That a particular string? Just a string, yeah, with some special characters in there, yeah. Like the forward slash and the utility thingy.
Yeah, that's funny.
Yeah, I'm just gonna.
Break out of the query and then.
Yeah.
Something so it does.
It could be. I'm not sure if they're escape characters or if those are the meta characters that they're talking about. Maybe it's they're both the same thing. But then they're going to have our payload encoded. So since it's a Metasploit module, it'll let you define your own payload up there, and then when you execute this, it'll just plug it into there. But if this wasn't a Metasploit module and it was just like a Python script or a C script that you had to compile or something, that's where you would plug your payload in. So we'll go over how you generate payloads and shells later, but let's just be, we'll do that anyway, but let's just be lazy and use this because I know it works. And yeah, so then once we define the variable, we say start, we try to connect to the client, negotiator client. I'm not sure what Ruby library or module this is using, but plug in the username, which is that. It's text type, timeout error, login error. So that's pretty simple. It's just going to try and log in with a username, special characters, and then as a payload attached. So obviously it's going to try and execute that somehow on SMB. So being borderline script kiddies, let's just, what is this name? Username map script command execution. All right, remember that name, because that's what we need to look for in Metasploit. So to boot up Metasploit, all of my awesome ethical hacking buddies up there will have written a bunch about Metasploit, whether we want to or not. And fun.
Aaron,
No.
no help means no hang up. So it's for executing a shell.
Ah, there you go. So yeah, I'll assume that those are escape characters, which escapes out of the string. So then SMB on the other end won't just be like interpreting the whole thing, it'll actually execute code. It's pretty cool that you can just plug the code into the string, but yeah. So we have Metasploit. And we want that username something. So yeah, since we don't have to generate our own payload, we'll come back. Oh yeah, that works. Don't execute an H-line. So modify the exploit and suit it so it'll suit what you want to do. Since we're using a Metasploit module, that's as simple as just setting the options in Metasploit. If it was a more manual exploit, then obviously you would have to be changing some code, and if you get something wrong, you might want to revisit. Just like when you're programming a program, if you get a character wrong, it'll probably not work debug, figure out why it didn't work, try it again. This is what we wanted, right? And it's rated as excellent. Even better. And this is where it is. So in Metasploit, we just go use, and nope, not that. So it loads up the module. And in the context, we can look at what we can set. So the remote host and the remote port is what we're targeting. So we'll set our hosts to, I think, 10.02.11. And our port, yeah, 139 is the 139, I think 145 or something are the SMB ports. So now we have an exploit, but we need a payload to attach to it. So when you've got a vulnerability, you've got an exploit, which generally means you can do something with the vulnerability on the service that the original programmers didn't intend for you to do, which is, if it's code execution, even better. It could be a denial of service thing where you crash it or use too much memory, or it could be anything. But then the payload for a code execution is what it executes, pretty much. So, like, what would you want it to do? If you could execute any code on a target server, what would you do?
Get a telnet connection.
Get a what?
Telnet connection.
Shit.
The second last one.
So this is, unfortunately, these are only the ones compatible with it. So I don't think we can't just straight up get a interpreter shell with this probably. It doesn't look like, SIMD, Unix.
Look at the generic one, generic command execution.
So these are basically, so the two, I think I've got this stuff in a slide later, but the two main sort of things is you can have bind shells or reverse shells. Anyone not heard of those before? No, yeah, a few, okay. So a bind shell is where you've got, so you're a target here and you're here. So a bind shell is when you open a listening cert port on the target, so they're listening for incoming connections and you connect to them. So you bind like a service to them and you can connect to it, disconnect to it, you can connect to it from anywhere. A reverse shell is better generally because you open a listening service on yours and you tell them to connect to you, and then you establish that connection. The main reason you'd want to do that is because when you set up a firewall, it's sort of your perimeter and you block incoming things. So if you set up a bind shell on a computer and there's a firewall there and you're trying to connect to it but it won't let you in, then there's no point in having a shell there. But firewalls are never really generally set up to stop outgoing connections. So if you can tell it to call you first and establish that tunnel or connection, then usually it'll just get straight through. So reverse shells are generally used, but there are uses for bind shells. Depends on the scenario, I guess. Let's just use I don't know. So when you're choosing what the language or what the protocol is going to be, what kind of shell it's going to use, you have to consider what might be running on the system. Like obviously you don't want to use a Python shell if you're attacking a box that probably won't have Python on it. But if you know that it will, then all the better.
So is that just like further enumeration and stuff?
Yeah, so you choose the best one that you know of, the most likely from the recon and enumeration you've done. Like for example, if I looked at that scan again, if there were any services running that would definitely be using Python, then I know it's got Python. Let's try Python reverse shell. So set payload to that. Now we have payload options. So the local host is ours, the remote host is the target's. So let's just set the
L host to 10029, set L port, naturally 13337, and we want a bash shell, which would be great. So we've basically modified the payload using Metasploit, which is really handy. It's all pointing there. In theory, if I just typed that, no. Let's try another payload. Reverse netcat. That worked. So command shell session 1 opened. So if we are in the root directory. If we list the root directory, so we have a raw Unix shell using netcat right now. So we'll be kind of limited with what we can do. Although, if you type we're running as the root user, so that means we can more or less do pretty much anything we want on the system, which isn't ideal because now we can't escalate privileges. But say now I have a shell on the box. So is any questions so far? Anyone not too sure about anything? Nah. All right, cool. So this is where it gets a bit better. So yeah, there's that. Shells available. So yeah, some protocols will be more reliable than other protocols, or languages. Just use the best one that is available to you, or the one that you reckon will be most likely to succeed. Let's come back and generate another one. So let's generate one now. So if we go back, right where that exploit said insert payload, since Metasploit inserted its own payload, but if we were going to, if it was a less automatic thing, let's find another exploit. No, Samba. Let's grab a more manual one. Let's find it.py. So this is not appropriate for our version, but let's just investigate the exploit. So, go straight to the top. Hopefully they leave notes. Sometimes they'll leave lots of information at the top that tells you everything you need to do. Sometimes there won't be a single comment, you have no idea. Luckily, this guy, Samba, is prone to this. Attacker can exploit it, execute arbitrary code with root privileges. Failed attempts will cause a denial of service condition. So this is important. This is a very important line. If it doesn't work, it might break Samba, it might break the box. You need to know exactly what it's going to do. If it says it might just crash Samba, then you could just have someone on call and say, hey, it might crash, I need you to restart it. Then you do it. If it does, then the world doesn't burn down. You don't have 6 people running around like headless chickens, and then they're like, it's your fault. But so GD finding targets. Okay. So if you are not familiar with coding, that is a weakness, and the only way you can really address that is to start doing stuff. Either writing your own scripts for things. If you wanted to learn a language, try and script things in that language. Or if you don't really want to script, you can just learn by reading code, but I reckon that's way more boring. But Google is like your friend for everything, not just coding, but literally everything in IT. So just, if you've never seen code or an exploit before, just pick one, start from the top. What does import mean? Google it. Import, okay, you import modules. There's an array here. What do these do? And just go through it bit by bit. So there's a bunch of random stuff that it's defining here. Pwn source is a cool. I assume that the pwn source variable is going to be very useful. But here we go. Here's the first function. So exploit. If you put in input a host, input a port, input CB port. I'm not sure what CB is, but you want to find that out too. And then target. It defines two variables. And you want to figure out exactly what it's doing. But what I'm looking for is where we put. So we don't. Okay, this was a bad example. We don't have to input our own payload or our own shell code as is, because it'll just execute commands straight away. It'll just allow us to. I'm not sure how it opens a shell though. But yeah, let's assume that there's a chunk there in the code that says payload or has shell code. There's got to be one here. Remote buffer overflow, remote command execution, buffer overflow. Let's put this one. No. It's kind of annoying. What's one that definitely has? Struts, remote code execution. Let's look at this one. No. Okay, payload is request. So this is not requiring shell code as a payload, but I would like to find a good example of one, if we could. I'll stuff it. But if you're looking through and it requires some raw shell code, which many of them do, you need to generate your own payload. And so this is basically, is anyone not familiar with the term shell code? Yeah. So it's basically, essentially, code that will, when executed, will open a shell to you, probably, to put it simply. But if we want to generate our own, there's a tool that is very useful called MSF Venom. You could write your own from scratch. There's other tools out there as well, but there's one with the Metasploit framework that's installed on Kali already called MSF Venom, which is very user-friendly. So like any command, use TAC-H or TAC-help, and it'll tell you how to use the command. If you want to read more, type man, then command. We want to choose a payload that's available, and it's just something that some people get hung up on. To look at the options that you can set on the payload, you use the payload options thing. Some exploits will say that these are bad characters. So that means like so we're going to be looking at characters for the shellcode all in hex, and it's all in little endian as well, which means it's backwards. But it may list characters as saying, do not use these characters because in the exploit it'll escape these characters, or these characters will break it, or the program will parse these characters differently. But you can just feed MSF Venom a list of bad characters, and it's smart enough to generate a payload without those characters. And if the exploit says that it can only be a max of, say, 50 characters or max of 100 characters, you can tell it as well, the size has to be this, so it'll keep it below that. But I'm really sick of this shitty Unix shell, so let's try and generate a new payload and see if we can execute it on Tebox. Has anyone used MSF Venom before? Yeah? 1, 2, no one's like, okay, cool. So if we go TAC H, these are our options. So we can set a payload. Is that big enough? Too big. We can set a payload. We can look at its options. So here we can list stuff, which will be very useful. So we can list payloads, list encoders, list NOPs, or list everything. A NOP sled, I don't want to bullshit. Hey Nick, NOP sled.
NOP sled. So in assembly language, there's an instruction. I think it's X90, and it's a no operation. So it's just like it does nothing, but it still uses a step in the processor.
Yeah.
So the idea is like if you can't get your function instruction pointer, the thing that is controlling the execution, if you can't get it to land right at the start of your shell code, you'll put a massive amount of NOPs before that. So if it lands anywhere in those NOPs, it'll just slide down into your shell code.
Nice. That. So format, we'll list the formats as well, but that's basically if we wanted it in a certain executable format or if we want it to be output in a certain coding language, which it'll just spit it out for us. The architecture and the space, we saw that before. Bad characters, iterations. So encoders, you can encode it, which basically will, what's the word I'm looking for? Well, it'll change the code to make it less detectable. It'll try and obfuscate it in certain ways. Obfuscate's not the right word, but yeah.
I don't want to be like kind of over here. Sorry.
Please tell me.
You know how you're talking about bad characters?
Yeah.
You use the encoder to encode that shell code to get rid of the bad characters you specify. So generally, if people put in like the 00, the null byte,
Yeah.
with a string copy function and all that, and see if it hits a null byte, it'll just stop. So the shell code will just stop. So the encoder is what you use to make those characters go away.
Okay. Actually, wait. I don't know how long this is, but.
Yeah, first I thought the encoder was for like bypassing antivirus and stuff, but then I watched this video and they were like, nah, it's not for that at all. Yeah, can everyone hear me?
No, this is for the recording.
Oh. Yeah, so the encoder is just used to get rid of bad characters like null bytes. So that's because, and the functions that are inherently, vulnerable are like string copy, where there's no bounds checking. So someone can write a whole heap of characters in there and overflow the buffer and whatnot. But if there's a null byte in the shell code, then that will signal to the string copy function that it's the end of the string. So the encoder will just swap up the instructions in the shell code in such a way that those null bytes won't have to be there. So instead of like moving a 0, which is a null byte, into part of a buffer or something, it'll do a weird instruction like XOR 2 registers, which still gives 0, but doesn't kill the shell.
All right, that's what that does. Let's play around with some of the encoders as well, or at least look at them. See how it changes the code. If we can get it to, although let's see if we can find a format that's human readable and see if we can play around with it. I've never used keep before. I don't know what that is. Preserve the template behavior, inject the payload as a new thread. That's actually not a bad idea. And then obviously we're going to want to save it somewhere. Alright, but let's just have a look at the possible payloads. Payloads. There are a lot of payloads. So if we look at the start of each line, it's all in alphabetical order, which is awesome. But first we'll have an operating system, and then the type, like I guess the type of shell, operating system, occasionally architecture as well, and then the type of shell it is, and a little more context around it as well. Since we know we're running a Linux host, it's running Debian, we're going to want to look for a Linux shell. Alright, so now we've got the choice between a 32-bit shell, which is x86, or a 64-bit shell. Obviously, you can run a 32-bit program on a 64-bit or 32-bit program, but you can't run a 64-bit on a 32-bit, a 64-bit program on a 32-bit processor. But how do we know what architecture this is running? We could do a lot of, maybe in our reconnaissance or our enumeration, we picked up what it is, but since we've got a shell open on it, we can kind of cheat a bit. So this command says, what is your operating system? Which isn't what we want necessarily. Let's open up, so we know it's running, okay, no, it says here. So we can see it's running Linux. It thinks that the OS is called Metasploitable. This is what we want. i686. So that's the architecture of the CPU. If you're not familiar with that term, something like i686 is 32-bit, or the x86. If you saw something like AMD 64, then that would be 64-bit architecture. So from that, we can tell that it's a 32-bit processor, which means we don't want to run a 64-bit shell on it. So we'll pick an x86 one. Meterpreter is nice. Let's try and get a Meterpreter shell, just because Meterpreter has lots of extra features that we want to use. That would be really handy. Oops. So let's grab that. Reverse TCP. So that means it's going to use a TCP protocol, not UDP or HTTP or anything like that. It's going to use TCP. It's going to be a reverse shell, so we will need to be listening on our side for it, and then once it executes, it'll connect to us, and it should work in theory on it, since it's a 32-bit and it's running Linux. So let's set that payload. What am I doing? MSF Venom payload is that. Awesome, but what are the options for that payload? That's where the payload options comes in. Cool. Lots of interesting info. Thank you, William Webb. Feel free to email this guy. But this is what we want. The basic options, which is going to be what are probably we have to change. So the local host and local port. That means just think about where you're sitting now. What's local to me? That's my computer. If it says R host or R port, that's the target, because that's remote to where you are. So we set the L host is going to be my IP. The L port is the port that I'm going to be listening on. And here we have lots of advanced options that do various different things. It'll say whether it's required, yes or no. You can set it to whatever. But in the interest of time, reverse listener bind address, we probably don't have to change anything now. Everything that's required, yes, has a value. So let's just use it. So if we look at the options, we're going to get rid of payload options. We know that the L host is going to equal 10.029. The L port is, what port do I want to listen on? 4444 is the default. We can just leave that as default. Nothing's using it, I hope. And so here we get to the format. So the format's going to be really important. This is going to matter very much for help formats. Obviously, we have to choose something that the target is going to be able to run. So if it's a Windows system, we might want a DLL or an EXE or something that's going to run on the system. If it has Java installed, it might execute a jar. Depending on the service that you're exploiting as well, you might be limited to certain things. So you can have it spit out an executable file, which if run, it'll execute the shell code. But if you're injecting your shell code into an existing exploit, you're going to want it in code, essentially. You're going to want it in a language. If it was a Linux host, you might want an ELF, like an ELF executable, VB. But we want to chuck it into an exploit, so we could have it output in C or Java code, PowerShell for Windows, Pi, Shell, SH for Shell, VB scripts. What would be appropriate for this? Let's just make a Linux executable in ELF. So let's just generate this payload, send it to our target, and execute it there and see if we can get a meterpreter session back. Remember that it's running on, we have to listen on 4444. All right, now that we have the format, we can define the architecture, but since we're asking for an x86, we're using an x86 payload, it's smart enough to say you're probably using x86. Bad chars, we don't care. Since we're going to be executing it on the system directly, we can just not worry about all that. Template, keep out var name. So encoders, we can touch on this real quick. MSF Venom L encoders. So these are the encoders that MSF Venom has access to. And so the most commonly used ones, as seen by the excellent thing, following any YouTube or Google tutorial or anything like that, it's going to use the Shikata Ganai encoder, which I think in Japanese basically means like nothing can be done, sort of. It's like it can't be helped. And that's, I don't know, Nick, that might mean something to you? No? Right, well that does that. Hopefully, what's the time now? 7:18. Hopefully we can quickly touch on Empire and PowerShell exploitation. But PowerShell base 64, base 64 is still used very well. But let's just use that. So we define the encoder is going to be x86 Shikata Ganai. And then we can see the last option we care about is iterations. So we can say, if we set an encoder, we can say iterate the encoder X times. So rather than just encoding it once, you can say encode it 50 times and it'll keep going until it doesn't work. But let's just do it, I don't know, 3 times? So iterate 3 times, encode with that, spit out an ELF executable, use those settings, and output the file as ponage dot, yeah, just, it'll do the thing. Succeeded. It's ended up being 204 bytes, 288 bytes, sorry. We see that there, run a file on it. That is oh, that's not good. with a corrupted section header, that might not work. Let's get rid of the encoding at least. See if that'll play nice. Let's try a different, rather than elf. Let's look at it in, I don't know, C or Python. If we get rid of the output, it'll just spit it into the console, which is might be useful. Let's just take a look at the shell code itself. So this is essentially what you're looking for. If you looked through exploits and you see something like that, that's the shell code most likely. If you see buffer, in buffer overflows, you fill up a buffer to a point and then add your own shell code, and it'll flow into different memory spaces. But if you see something like that in an exploit, that's the payload that that person used. So you don't want to execute theirs, you want to execute your own. So you'll have to remove theirs and place your own in there. And if that's like, what the fuck, then just Google a bit on buffer overflows, essentially. If you can understand, you don't have to get all of it, but if you just get a bit to know what it's doing, then that'll be really useful. I really want an elf executable. Come on, give me one. So I'm probably doing something wrong. Please, if any of you know what I'm doing wrong, let me know. I don't think that's gonna work. Maybe a different payload. Oh well. Either way, you just that's sort of what you have to. That's how you generate your own payload, and that's one way of generating your own payload. And you can just play around with it and read about it. There's lots of info online. There's lots of guides and stuff. Try not to just follow one blindly, but get it. x86. Da da da. I'll try one last time, and if it doesn't give me a good thing, then we'll just move on. We want Linux, we want x86, maybe ditch the interpreter. Let's just see if we can get one working. Reverse TCP that. Oops, we want, that was silly. Shell, reverse TCP, output as an elf. Anything? I don't know, maybe let's just try executing it. It might not work, but screw it. So if you play around, try and play around with Metasploitable. As part of an attack, if you can figure out, you'll need to figure out a way to send files to your target and retrieve files from the target. Obviously, just with a shell itself, you can do some things like that. If you have a small file, like some shell code or something, you could just copy paste it into the terminal, and that's essentially sending a file. But if you have much larger files, then that's not really a viable option. If you look at Metasploitable, you can see there's an FTP server. That could be handy. See if you can play around with getting things backwards and forwards like that. There's a web server. If you can exploit the web service, there might be file include vulnerabilities or any way you can find to upload. But let's just, so since we still have this awesome shell here, which is still working, the which command will sort of look for commands on the system. So I know that it's running netcat, which is super useful. It's already got netcat installed, which you should all be familiar with. We could use that. That's going to be real. Let's just be lazy and use that. I'm just going to run to temp. Since we have root on the system, we can pretty much read and write wherever we want. But if we didn't have root, the /temp directory is generally writable by all users, so that's usually a good spot to try and chuck stuff if you figured out a way to upload stuff. And I guess I'll backtrack a little as well. If you can get if there's netcat on the system or a similar style of thing, you can do one step up from copy pasting into the console. If you can open a raw listening socket with netcat or something similar, you can just blow data at it and it'll essentially catch it. What I could do from the server, so this is me in Metasploitable on the left with a shell, and this is me on my local Kali. If I say I want to listen on port 9999, let's just do that. I'm going to connect to this on 9999. So can you see what it's doing here? Do you see that? If I input anything on this side, it interprets it on that side, which is cool. But what if, I think I just killed my session. Since it's Metasploitable, boop, we have a working exploit. Let's just get a new one. Go back to temp. Okay, cool. What I could do instead, since if we throw stuff at it, it's receiving data, and we can see that. But what you can do instead is open a listening port, listen on port 9999, and using shell, you could pipe that into a file. So this is saying any input, anything from standard in to that command gets saved to a file on this system in text format to that file in the current directory. And then now, oops, we don't want that. I have this file here on my system. If I try to read it, it looks like shit because it's an ELF executable. You could open it up in a debugger, or you could open it up in hex or whatever, but we don't really care. What we can do is, so we don't want to echo. If I type that, it outputs it to my standard out, right? But if you could output it and then pipe it into another command, to the standard in of another command. So say I want to use that netcat connect again. Do you see what this is doing? So if you're not familiar with this pipe symbol, that basically means take the standard out of this command and then pump it into the standard in of the next command. So for example, if I wanted to grep for something like, so ls lists all of the files in the directory, right? If you type ls, it dumps what it can find to the standard out of this command. And since it's a shell, it outputs that to the shell. If I wanted to search for something, I could go ls, then pipe, then use the grep command. So grep means search, like control F, basically. I can grep for disk. So it says, list the files to standard out, and then send that to the standard in of grep. Grep is a standalone command by itself, but if I say grep for this, it'll take that, run its own command, and then output it to standard out. You can pipe as many as you want, and then at the end you could use a little caret thing to save it to a file. You can do whatever you want. But if I did that, it outputs the text disk demo. So for this, I'm basically saying send all the data of this file to that, and that saves it to a file. So we don't know if it completed or not, but since it's pretty small, it probably did. Let's just kill that. I don't want to kill the shell again, but yeah, fuck it. That's really, this is, yeah, barbaric. But now we have this file that we saved. That kind of looks the same, but if we want to know for sure, we can see that the original file was 207 bytes, and this new file is 207 bytes. So we know that the file is exactly as it was. So we've essentially uploaded a file through a shell. So that's just, if you get a shell on something, you need to upload, download files, and you can't do it in one line, then that's a really good way to do big chunks of information. There's no real limit on that, on how much data you could send, other than bandwidth or maybe stability. You might crash the shell if you use way too much memory for it or something. But that's a really handy way to do it. Now that we have it here, it probably won't work because it's corrupt header or whatever, but let's just try anyway. Wait, this wasn't a Metasploit shell, was it? It's just a Unix TCP shell, so let's just listen for it on port 4444, I think. So that's essentially kind of like a bind shell on our computer. We're listening, waiting for input to come in. And here, let's just... So if you're not too familiar with Linux, what are they called? Permissions, like permissions on files. You'll see this sort of string might be, or even on your Mac or on your Android phone, because they're all Unix-based systems. These sort of strings basically determine who's allowed to do what with the files. So the first one will either be a D or not a D. That means it's a directory or it's not. And then you've got a space for R, X. These are in 3 sections. So that stand for read, write, and execute. And each chunk of 3 determines what. So I don't even remember what. I think this might be like the owner, and then root. And then other. Root, user, owner, other. User, group, other. User, group, then other. Yeah, and you can see here who owns it. And I think the group that it belongs to, something like that. But we can look at our executable here and says that we can read and write, but we can't execute. But we want to change that. So that's just, this is sort of Linux stuff. If you haven't done Linux shell stuff yet, do those introductory things like the over the wire bandit, the Linux journey. This is all pretty, yeah. But if we change it, so we're basically saying add the execute permission to this file. We didn't order pizza. Do you guys want to order it?
I did it.
You did it?
Yeah.
Oh, fuck yeah. We ordered pizza. So now it has all the execute rights. So that's just a little thing that you might run into. If you try to run something and you say you don't have permission, check the permissions, and you probably need to give it permission if you can. Nah, it broke. So that's probably because the executable wasn't properly generated. We could say that it was like, so it's kind of expected behavior. But what we can see is that it did kind of work because we know that it connected back to this. And then as soon as I tried to send something, it just went. But if it wasn't fucked up, then we would have a new shell, and that would be great, in theory. So, you know, semi-demo. So that's how we generate a payload. So I should have probably gone through this before, but say you have a shell on a system, and what are you going to do with it? The first thing you probably want to do is like get as much info as you can from the system in the context of the user that you have a shell of. So I've chucked these links here. They're not too bad. The Linux one's good, but there's more online. If you just sort of search like post-exploitation cheat sheet or post-exploitation commands, they're really good references. But so say on a Linux host, you could dump the bash history, which is basically the history of all the commands run in the shell. So before you even run any commands, you can just look at what commands have been run previously. You can get a really good idea of like what the system's used for, what previous administrators or people logged in have done on it. That's also going to be very important for covering your tracks later as well, because anything that you execute in shell is going to be saved into bash history as well. Don't go and just delete the bash history. There's nothing more obvious than there not being a bash history there to say that someone has been there. You want to remove what you've done from the bash history. If you can, dump password hashes. So in Linux, you'll need admin or root to access the file where password hashes are stored. But in Windows, just run Mimikatz and it'll just dump it for you. If you're not familiar with Mimikatz, it's awesome. You can look at the DNS cache on the system to see what that system has been talking to previously, so you can get an idea of what it's communicating to, processes that are running, ports that are open. So let's just have let's have a good look at the system since we still have this shell. I know so let's check the bash history first. So since we're, actually first, yeah, let's check the bash history. So cat is the command to output the text of a file. So bash history is usually stored in the home directory and then .bash_history. Nothing. File. That's not good. That's not very useful for us because that basically says the root's bash history links directly to a black hole where everything goes to die. So it's literally saying don't save any bash history to the best of my knowledge. So there's no bash. We can look at it on Linux, on Kali. So if we go cat, we can see all of the previous commands that were run in bash.
Take care, buddy.
See ya, dude. That's not too accurate. History, C. All right. What else can we do? The etc password file tells you all of the users that are on the system. So this is accessible to all users. So that's, if you can't dump the password hashes straight away, you can find out what users that exist on the system. So a lot of users will be like to services pretty much. So we can see that there's a mail user, and it'll tell you the user ID as well. So the ID of root is always 0. There's a sys user, bin user, MySQL user, Tomcat for Apache, but what I'm looking for is, yeah, MSF admin. So that's our best friend, the MSF admin user for Metasploitable. And we can see that its home directory is at home/MSF admin, which is pretty normal. Its path file, I'm not sure if that's actually the path variable or if that's extra shit, but what else did we say? Dump password hashes, DNS history. So if we have root, which we do, which is awesome, we could dump the password hashes file. So this is sort of like the equivalent to the password file, which is sort of confusingly named, I guess. The password file is all the usernames, and the shadow file is all the password hashes. But if we look at MSF admin, here we can see the password hash. So if you're not sure what this is, just Google, Linux password hash, and it'll tell you. But basically, the first chunk tells you what hashing algorithm it is, and then it'll be followed by the hash. And any seeds, I think, might be stored in there too. But you can take that hash and try and reverse that hash. If you can't reverse that hash, you can compare that hash to other password dumps. So if you search for that hash in other password dumps and hashes line up, you can follow that trail and maybe follow it through password dumps and maybe reach like either a plain text password, or you might reach a password dump that stored passwords really shittily with like no seed or whatever. What else? Process is running. If you go and run a PS, you can see all the processes that are running currently and their process IDs. So this could be useful if you, well, first off, you know what the computer's doing, but it'll also reveal some surfaces that you might not have found in your initial recon. What else? We can do netstat. And we can see all of the network sockets that are currently being used, but most importantly, all of the So yeah, we can see here, way better than doing an nmap scan since we're on the inside. We can see that it is listening on all of these ports, on the local addresses for any IP from the foreign addresses. So these are all the ports that are actually open on the computer, and we know that 100% for a fact. So you want to get as much info as you can from the system. If you don't have a root account or a local admin, you want to escalate your privileges. I won't go too much into that because that's like a whole talk in itself. Google it, I guess. Escalating privileges depends on what OS you're running, depends on the programs, depends on the scenario. There's lots of different techniques to escalate your privilege. You might want to try and gain persistence. So that means, like, if someone was to go and reboot this server right now, I would lose my shell. It would just disconnect. It wouldn't call home again. So establishing persistence is, again, there's lots of different ways to do it, but you want to be able to reconnect to it later at some point, or you want to tell it to be calling home to you, trying to reconnect to you. So if it gets rebooted, or if you know, it stops for some reason, it'll try and reconnect. Because as you saw before, I accidentally lost my shell like that because I just pushed the wrong button. I was like, oh shit, my shell's gone. If that was the only chance you had at the shell, and you didn't have another chance to exploit it again, you'd be back to square one. So you can do further recon as well. If you had a more advanced network setup, if there were like firewalls and stuff, you probably have better access to the network now. You might have a foothold with more access or closer to the system, or at least if you do recon from that system, it'll look to the network as if it's coming from that computer. If you start doing really, really suspicious shit, they'll be like, that's not normal. But you'll be on access control lists, so you might get through firewalls. And then pivoting is what it sounds like. If you find further things to exploit from that system, if you've got a foothold on that system, you can jump to another one. You want to try and exploit a new system which might get you further to your goal. If you were trying to, say, dump Reese's database, don't fucking do that. But if you're trying to dump their database, you might get a system on the perimeter. Like, all right, now we need to figure out the internal network. We do that. I won't give too much away, but you find the database. You might not be able to access it. You find something that can. You get to that. Then you might get to the database and you just pull it all out, and then I murder you. But so, what is it? 740. We played around with Metasploit. I don't know. What do you guys want to do? Do you want to try and hack stuff, or do you want to look at some more stuff, more demo stuff? Gee, thanks, Chris. What have I got? Metasploit, you all kind of know. There's a link. Meterpreter is a shell that has more capabilities, more commands, more functions than just a raw Unix shell, because that's just you're executing commands in the context of the system. Meterpreter sort of does extra stuff on your side, and you can do more with it, basically. If you can have a Meterpreter shell, it'll make your life a bit easier. The other thing is Empire, which I'm pretty new to, but Empire is probably the coolest thing in the world that I've ever found. Also, there's no CTF this week. I didn't have time. That's all right. You have Metasploitable. Empire is basically, if you want to get into do stuff with penetration testing at all in the real world, I guaranteed that you'll be looking at Windows domains and Windows networks. If you're looking at Windows machines at all, you'll be interested in using PowerShell. And Empire is essentially an entire framework that I reckon is better than Metasploit, built off PowerShell tools and PowerShell modules. And it's all sort of been put together into this big thing called Empire. So it works for Windows. It's a lot more stable, it's a lot more reliable, it has way more options and way more customization. It sort of, I think by default, right at the moment, Empire agents don't even touch the file system themselves once they're executed. Oh, fuck yes. Pizza. I'll bitch on until the pizza gets here. But what's really fucking cool is that most of them use just in-memory techniques as is. So you won't even be touching the file system. You won't write to files. You avoid a lot of antivirus stuff which deals with looking at dodgy files. If it runs completely in memory, you have to have a better antivirus which sort of looks at those. We've got a bit of time. Let's see if we can play around with it. I've got this Windows box, which would be good. So let's just ditch this. But yeah, have a go with Metasploitable. Try and do as much as you can. Try and exploit as many of the do a proper full Nmap scan on it. You can do it on crazy speed, doesn't matter. Do all the ports, look at all the services, look at TCP, UDP, find all the services, try and hack every single one if you can. They're all vulnerable to something. But take a quick squiz at Empire. What? I have an agent on this machine. Is that... Let's just delete that and start again. See if we can be sneaky with it. So we have a Windows 7 machine. Nope, that's not it. (10.02.15). So let's ditch that. Unreachable. Is that because of the firewall? So obviously I want to demonstrate this with the firewall turned on, because realistically firewalls will be turned on. Just want to see if it was that. Did we turn it off? Turn off firewall, turn off firewall. I can't talk to... Ah, that's why. Come on. Come on, come on, come on. Hey, we're getting something from that. It's now 10:02.5. And they can talk. Alright, let's turn that firewall back on. There shouldn't be too much differences between Windows 7 and Windows 10, other than Windows 10 might have the default Defender, Bitdefender thing enabled, which might pick stuff up. So you might need to be sneakier with it. There's lots of different ways you can obfuscate these things to make it harder to detect or harder to find. We still have an agent there. That's all right. Let's just ignore that. So the way that Empire works is you open up a listener, and that listens on your computer for stuff, and you generate what's called stages or launches, which are set up for that listener. You can set them up in all sorts of different types of formats, but basically they're all programmed to call home to your listener whenever they're executed. And then you can just go and spread these agents into the wild, or at your target, or try every sort of vector you can. I'm still learning this, so yeah, use listener HTTP. So you can set all the options for your listener. So let's say bind to my IP address. It can stay on port 80. It's going to host a Microsoft IIS server. You can have it do other HTTP servers if you want. There's lots of other, all of this stuff you can configure to make it difficult to find. You can set it as HTTPS, so it's all encrypted. You can have it hook into a Slack bot as well. So if you wrote your own Slack bot that will alert you and notify you when stuff happens, you can have it integrate with that as well, which is kind of ridiculous. So this is the way that it's going to launch your agent, like the shellcode that calls to your agent. Nice. All right, pizza. Do you guys want to call it here? Yeah, fuck you, Emil. I should probably stop swearing, but I won't. And then basically, let's just see if that works. No, yep. So we have a listener running. So it's running a HTTP server on this IP, on this port, and now we can generate stages. So these are all the types of ways we can, they're not exactly payloads because they're a little bit more complex in certain ways, but basically all it's trying to do is make a computer call back to our listener. And there's lots of different ways you can do this. You can generate an executable, you could have a DLL. Maybe next time we can demo that as well, but if you get a DLL, there's a technique called reflective DLL injection, which basically injects a DLL straight into memory or into a running process and executes that code without any file ever touching the file system whatsoever. So traditional antivirus just doesn't stand a chance. So you could use a DLL, you could generate a DLL this way and then set that up to however you can get it, whatever vector you have available. But let's just use the basic PowerShell launcher because I know we're hungry. Launcher PowerShell on that listener. So that's just saying use whatever the settings are for that listener for this. And if we look, this is a PowerShell command. So if we ran this, and Empire is kind of ridiculous as well in that it runs PowerShell code and PowerShell scripts even if PowerShell isn't installed on the computer. It just has to be a Windows PC with CMD on it. That's all you need. If PowerShell isn't even there, it'll still work. So it's saying run PowerShell, and then it's encoded in base 64, and then this is the command that it is. It's encoded in base 64, so if we wanted to look at what that does, we can real quick. Oh, yep. All right, let's just dump that there, and base 64 decode. So this is the actual PowerShell code that it's running. And you can see with the alternating caps, it's a little bit obfuscated. You can set obfuscation as well, so it'll jumble in lots of random meta characters to try and confuse anything. But that's basically what it's trying to do. So if you want to see what it is, that's the entire agent right there. But if we so let's just skip ahead. Say we found a way to, say we send a phishing email with a link to a reflective DLL hosted site, or we get them to execute an executable or any kind of random shit. Let's just say that we can jump ahead and say they execute our code for some reason. And in theory, so that's the one I had from earlier. There's Arvo. Hey, here we go. It worked. So we received a connection to our listener, a new agent checked in, it sent another stage, so that's sending more code for it to execute to establish what it is. Now if we see we have two agents here, and we can do all sorts of stuff, interact with the agents, and it has lots of already inbuilt things. We could just start executing commands. It's far more reliable in that you're not interacting with a direct raw shell straight to the socket, but what you're doing is when you tell it to do stuff through Empire, what it does is schedule tasks for that agent to run. You can you can automate tasks for it to run. You could scatter them. You could say you can set working hours for your agents and say only work during these times or avoid these times. And if those tasks fail or if something goes badly, it's not going to drop your shell because the agent is still there. It's scheduling tasks, possibly even scheduling Windows tasks. But yeah, play around with that as well. Empire is really cool. But I've bitched on for way too long today. I'm fucking sick of talking, so I'm going to shut up now. But I don't have a CTF. Try stuff on Metasploitable. That's the easiest place to start. And once you sort of have a feel, you can graduate to bigger and better things. The Syska in a box things from previous years are really awesome as well. They sort of have their own sort of virtual private networks set up with multiple hosts all in the one VM. So that's another really good. There's Hack the Box online. There's heaps of vulnerable VMs. That's it. You guys? Anything? Pizza? Pizza? Pizza. All right, let's get out of here.